A great number of vegetables that we harvest from our gardens or buy from the supermarkets are actually fruits. Botanically speaking, anything that's derived from the ovary of the plant is technically a fruit. So things like courgettes and beans, tomatoes, sweet corn, peas, they're all actually fruiting vegetables. And the key to the success of all of these different fruiting vegetables is pollination. Without pollination taking place properly, the fruits will not swell, and therefore you get a poor harvest, or you'll end up with some of your courgettes falling off. They just shrivel up and fall off. Or you might get a bean pod or a pea pod with hardly any beans or peas inside it. And this is down to a lack of pollination or only semi-pollinated fruits. And sometimes you get a distorted strawberry, let's say, or an apple, and that's usually for the same reason. There are two agents of pollination, and one is wind and the other are insects. Just going to have a look at a wind pollinated plant at the moment. This is sweet corn, and these are the male flowers. They are born on, technically they're flower spikes, but you can't see any flowers because they don't need to attract insects. And the pollen is produced from the male flowers, and it falls down onto these silky threads, which are actually the stigma of the female flower, and each one of those individual threads links up with one of the tiny kernels of corn inside the sheath that surrounds the young developing seeds, and it requires a grain of pollen to land on each of those individual little threads there to pollinate each individual kernel of corn, so that you get a full corn cob. And that's why we plant sweet corn in blocks, so there's more chance of wind blowing the pollen onto those fine silky sort of flowers. If you have a period of really heavy rain or extremely strong winds when they're in flower, you may get poor pollination as well. Here we've got some courgettes. You can see these also have separate male and female flowers on the same plant, and the female flowers have that ovary behind the flower. That's what we call the courgette. And you can see just here there's a male flower. It doesn't have the courgette behind it. I've opened some up to show you inside, and these interesting structures here inside the male flower bear the pollen, and it requires an insect to transfer the pollen from inside of this flower, which only opens for one day, onto the structure inside the female flower. Now I'm not going to open this one because I don't want to damage it, but there's a sort of slightly larger structure that receives the pollen, and then the ovary or courgette will begin to grow. Peas are hermaphrodite flowers. They contain both the male and the female structures, so they're more likely to self-pollinate, and you have less problems really with poor pollination, although they do still attract insects. Butterflies and bees in particular are attracted to the pea flowers. And you can see there my sugar snap peas ready to harvest. And these are the ovaries forming or swelling from inside the flower, and you can just make out there's a number of seeds inside there also swelling, and they again would have required a single grain of pollen for each one to be fertilized. Tomatoes are also hermaphrodite, but they tend to have the stamens protruding outside of the flower, and it's less likely that their own pollen will fall onto their own stigma, and therefore self-pollination is less likely, and they do require the insects more. And again, poor pollination will lead to poor or distorted tomato cropping. And here's my basil that I interplanted in between the tomatoes, if you remember. It has a dual purpose. One, it detracts the unwanted insects, but it also attracts pollinators, so that's a really useful companion. I'm just looking here, this bottom leaf's got to come off. It's touching the floor, it's starting to go yellow. It's more likely to get disease from rain splash, and I'm trying to avoid blight this year by covering the soil and removing the lower leaves of my tomatoes. Here we've got a really attractive climbing bean called Blue Cocoa. It's got beautiful purple flowers. You can see here it's reached the top of the climbing frame that I made for them out of hazel rods, and actually it's going beyond there, and if you want you can actually pinch out the top of these beans and help them to set the fruits lower down and also to produce some more side shoots. These are just flowering, and again these rather like the peas are hermaphrodite, but they do self pollinate quite easily, and you can save the seeds of your beans, and they should come true. Just the last little picture here. Here's a little harvest today. We've got some new potatoes, my first courgettes of the year, sugar snap peas, and I've also harvested some calendula or marigold flowers because I'm going to make some herbal skincare products with a group later on.